My name is Laura Taylor, and I'm a community engagement specialist with the Metro Vancouver Environment Department working on regional climate change. Today, I want to share with you the scope of the issue, which is mainly needing stronger emission reductions. And then I'm going to provide my recommendations for how to best achieve that through a holistic and decolonial approach. Metro Vancouver is a federation of governments in the area shown here. The Environment Department develops and implements plans and strategies that improve air quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been very clear that globally we need to stabilize warming at a rate of 1.5 degrees. Metro Vancouver has adopted this target and has set the goal of a 45% reduction by 2030. The issue is that even if the bold actions in its climate strategies are all accomplished, modeling has shown that there won't be a 45% reduction. The shortfall is shown here on the graph at about 35%. To increase emission reduction, the department must focus on systemic changes to climate change drivers rather than symptoms, which are colonialism and capitalism. So, the best way to approach climate action holistically is decolonization through real partnership with Indigenous communities. Metro Vancouver's climate goals could be reached by supporting Indigenous climate strategies and contributing its implementation capacity. These strategies, a couple we'll explore in a minute, honor a holistic model that plans for a newly restored relationship to the earth and to each other through robust equity considerations. The current focus of Metro Vancouver's climate action and strategy is technical and data driven. And while valuable, an Indigenous lens that considers equity is still needed. This is even identified in the UN Sustainable Development Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. Equity analysis for Metro Vancouver's climate plans is presented as a distinct element, as opposed to being inextricable to the actions identified in sectors like transportation, buildings, and industry. Many of the identified equity actions are commitments to develop equity measures, but the technical actions are already published. Both climate strategies acknowledge that those with less financial resources will have fewer options to protect themselves when a major weather or pollution event occurs and may have more difficulty recovering from impacts. While the department's approach has been performing equity analysis after developing environmental policy, this separation impedes comprehensive analysis. There's an intrinsic provable connection that higher levels of national inequality tend to go hand in hand with increased ecological degradation. In order to incorporate greater equity in environmental policy, the public engagement process should be amended to include greater equity considerations in engagement. While lowering emissions, Metro Vancouver must work to remove structural barriers that cause these disparities through engagement of vulnerable populations. For example, people with unstable housing are identified by the department as a demographic that may experience greater effects of decreased air quality, but there's no current plan to support programs that provide stable housing to reduce homelessness. Engagement for regional environmental issues also suffers from imbalanced stakeholder power. In a neoliberal age of capitalist power, many industry organizations have appointed lawyers or government relations staff whose role it is to provide feedback on issues that will affect their operations. Barriers to individual resident participation, especially those experiencing health and economic disadvantages, mean industry feedback often outweighs community support or neutrality for environmental protection. This creates a causal loop of inequality as shown here. The future success of environmental policy implementation requires limiting the power of corporate perspective and platforming the perspectives of vulnerable communities and the silent majority. Transformative system change is needed to stop the constant growth model that gives these corporations their power, and here is where Indigenous communities can lead. But during transition, Metro Vancouver can play a valuable regulatory role in limiting corporations' ability to pollute with impunity. To properly eliminate the cause of equity issues, there will need to be a transformation of power structures. Indigenous Climate Action, or ICA, argues that this will require a deep and broad relinquishment of power from settler colonial structures and systems to ensure meaningful co creation of climate policy. Metro Vancouver's goal is a steep decline in emissions. So, First Nations transformational strategies will benefit the organization. As a colonial government, they are not, as ICA identifies, equipped to lead the transformative change away from colonial capitalist extractive economies, but Indigenous communities are. Supporting existing Indigenous climate strategies is a concrete way for Metro Vancouver to achieve both Indigenous collaboration and holistic equity integration. The recommendation here is specifically these two plans. In order to address the connection between climate change and inequality, these plans emphasize solutions that are multidimensional and interconnected. Indigenous communities have been some of the strongest advocates of climate change solutions with the most progressive targets, and collaborating on implementing these plans could close the gap between the IPCC targets and Metro Vancouver's modeling predictions. Even for technical actions, collaboration will better address climate drivers. For example, Metro Vancouver identifies actions that promote hydropower and electrification of transportation and buildings. ICA has said this approach has negative impacts to Indigenous lands and regional ecosystems. ICA also criticizes colonial climate plans creating a polluter pay system, which allows large corporations to swallow the cost of regulatory fines like Metro Vancouver's in order to continue releasing emissions. A starting place for this work would be to pursue collaborative consent, which would be an ongoing process of partnership between Indigenous communities and Metro Vancouver acting as equal partners. This would mean setting up the social architecture for a true partnership that operates indefinitely. For this to succeed, Metro Vancouver would need to recognize the authority of First Nations to take the lead on system transformation initiatives and support where agreed upon using its implementation capacity and regulatory body. The recommendations from both ICA and FNLC's climate plans should be in scope for these collaborative partnerships. These include raising leadership from Indigenous women and 2S LGBTQIA plus folks, addressing the root cause of climate change like colonial capitalism, extraction, and engaging in intersectional understanding of climate to design intersectional climate solutions that reduce emissions and inequity. These partnerships, implementing Indigenous climate strategy, will benefit Metro Vancouver by better reaching its climate targets. Embracing a First Nations climate lens will also challenge the conventional colonialist narratives of First Nations as passive recipients of climate impacts and instead honor their unique holistic relationship to the land that positions them as drivers of change. Thank you.